The heat of the midday sun bore down on the gathered crowd, but the sweat dripping down their faces came not only from the weather. Soldiers barked orders as villagers were dragged into the square, shackled together, their eyes darting between the muskets leveled at them and the cannons ominously stationed nearby. The atmosphere was suffocating, a silence so heavy that even the rustling of chains seemed deafening. Then came the first punishment. A man stripped to the waist, lashed to a post, his body trembling before the whip even struck. The crack split the air, followed by a scream that seemed to stretch forever. Bones shifted under the blows, flesh ripped open, and the people forced to watch felt their stomachs twist. For them, this was no execution of law. This was theatre, a performance of terror where every shriek, every drop of blood, was meant to teach obedience. This was the British Empire, not the polished portraits of red-coated officers and Victorian order that history books often present, but the empire as it was lived by those beneath its boot. The reality was a sprawling dominion that relied not just on economic might or military superiority, but on the spectacle of suffering. These were acts designed to break the body and crush the spirit, staged with precision to send a clear message: resist, and your death will not only be certain, but unforgettable. It is tempting to imagine that such horrors belong to the ancient world, to the gladiatorial games of Rome or the blood-soaked rituals of despots long dead. But the empire of Queen Victoria and her successors carried its own arenas across the globe. They were not stone amphitheatres filled with cheering crowds, but parade grounds, dusty squares and prison camps, all transformed into stages of humiliation and pain. The victims were rebels, villagers, enslaved men and women, or simply the unfortunate caught in the gears of colonial paranoia. In the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, Britain's empire stretched further than any before it. With territories in India, Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond, it claimed to bring progress and civilization. But behind the rhetoric of order and improvement lurked a darker truth. To hold so vast a dominion required more than laws. It required fear. Fear crafted through rituals of public punishment so grotesque that entire communities would whisper of them for generations. Some were hanged before their peers, others mutilated, others strapped to the barrels of cannons and obliterated into fragments of bone and ash. Imagine the effect on a child watching their father marched into such a scene, or on a community forced to clean the blood-stained earth where neighbors had been executed. These were punishments not meant only for the condemned, but for the living. Psychological warfare disguised as justice. In India during the uprising of 1857, in Jamaica after revolts, in Kenya during the Mau Mau crisis, the formula was the same. The spectacle had to be unforgettable, the cruelty so unimaginable that resistance itself seemed pointless. Yet within this machinery of horror lay contradictions. The same empire that held parliamentary debates on morality and Christian virtue carried out acts of savagery far more disturbing than many of its enemies. Documents were censored, eyewitnesses silenced, and archives destroyed to protect reputations back home. But still, whispers slipped through. Letters describing prisoners whipped until their spines snapped. Diaries noting executions carried out before thousands. Rumors of camps where torture was routine. This was no ordinary justice system, no accidental cruelty. It was a deliberate structure of domination. And while the gallows and the whip may seem relics of another age, the scars remain etched in memory, culture, and historical record. The story of the British Empire's most brutal arena acts is not one of isolated events, but of a carefully sustained system of fear, a hidden theatre where the cost of defiance was staged as a nightmare for all to see. But this opening is only a glimpse. The real horror is still to come. Power in the British Empire did not rest solely on ships, rifles, or laws written in distant London. Its true foundation was fear, and fear was carefully cultivated. Governors and generals understood that to hold millions in subjugation, they needed more than victories in battle. They needed the people to believe resistance was hopeless. Public punishment became their tool, a grotesque theatre where bodies were broken, not only to kill individuals, but to instruct entire societies. Consider the flogging posts erected in the Caribbean, where enslaved men and women were tied down, their backs turned into raw pulp under the lash as overseers forced others to watch. The sound of leather striking flesh was as much a command as it was a punishment. Obey, or this will be you. In India, rebels were paraded before villages, sentenced in front of friends and family, and executed with the deliberate goal of imprinting terror. The arena was not stone and sand, but the dusty square of a cantonment, the forecourt of a jail, or the center of a plantation. The performance was not for entertainment, but for domination. Fear became a currency, and paranoia drove its inflation. The British colonial mind was always haunted by the possibility of rebellion. Every whisper of unrest seemed to confirm their darkest fears, and each rumor sparked disproportionate retribution. In Jamaica, after the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865, hundreds were hanged or shot in rush trials, their bodies left dangling as warnings to the living. In India, after the uprising of 1857, officers spoke openly of making an example of captured rebels. Men tied to cannons and blasted apart in front of crowds. These were not spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were planned rituals designed to show that British authority was not merely unchallengeable, but merciless. The cruelty was cloaked in the language of justice. Officials spoke of discipline, order, and deterrence. They called executions necessary and floggings corrective. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay a perverse ritual of control. Prison camps became laboratories of humiliation. Prisoners stripped naked, beaten until unconscious, sometimes revived just to be beaten again. Guards staged these acts before other detainees, forcing them into the role of unwilling spectators. The effect was psychological, breaking not only the body of the victim, but the spirit of the entire community. To the colonizers, this was order. To the colonized, it was a daily reminder that their lives could be extinguished at a whim. Children grew up with gallows looming on the horizon, with stories of fathers shot before their villages, with the memory of mothers whipped for defiance. Terror seeped into the fabric of daily life until silence itself became survival. The British arena was not built of stone, but of routine horror. And yet, within this cruelty, lurked the seeds of downfall. Brutality bred resentment, resentment fostered rebellion. Every public execution created martyrs whispered about in homes and sung about in hushed tones. Each act of humiliation deepened the resolve of some to resist, however impossible it seemed. Paranoia drove harsher punishments, and harsher punishments sowed the very unrest they were meant to prevent. The empire's power, then, was both strengthened and poisoned by its reliance on cruelty. Its rulers wielded fear like a blade, sharpening it with every spectacle of pain. But a blade that cuts too deeply can slip from the wielder's hand. The arenas of suffering that kept order also prepared the stage for collapse. For every broken body, there were witnesses who would carry the memory. And memories can be more dangerous than armies. The British Empire may have believed itself untouchable, but the cracks were already spreading. Its cruelty was not a sign of confidence, but of fear. And as with all empires built on terror, the day would come when the spectacle no longer inspired submission, but fury. The square was packed with bodies, soldiers forming a ring of steel around the trembling crowd. Families were forced to stand shoulder to shoulder, their children clutching their hands, eyes wide with terror. At the center of this human arena stood a cannon, its barrel tilted upward like the open maw of some monstrous beast. Bound before it was a man, once a soldier, now labeled a traitor. His arms were lashed tightly, his chest pressed against the cold iron. He tried to speak, but the gag cut his words into muffled sobs. His eyes darted toward the people he knew were watching, toward his wife at the edge of the square, her face pale with horror. The executioner gave no speech. The Empire spoke through spectacle, not words. With a signal, the cannon thundered, and in an instant his body ceased to exist as whole. A spray of blood, bone, and charred flesh rained across the onlookers. Some screamed, others turned away. Children wept. The British officers watched with blank faces, satisfied not by justice, but by the message that echoed louder than the blast. This is the fate of those who defy. The practice of being blown from a cannon was among the most horrifying of the Empire's punishments, reserved for rebels in India after the uprising of 1857. It was not chosen for efficiency, but for its effect. Hanging might kill quietly, shooting might dispatch quickly, but the cannon scattered a man's body in fragments, unrecognizable, unrecoverable. In a society where the afterlife and burial rites held profound meaning, this was not just murder, it was the destruction of the soul itself. Witnesses described villagers collapsing in grief, soldiers turning pale, and yet the British commanders ordered the executions to continue, one after another, until the square was slick with gore. The condemned were not hardened criminals, but farmers, clerks, soldiers who had dared to mutiny, or sometimes men accused with little proof at all. Their trials were brief, if they happened at all, and their sentences designed less for individual guilt than for communal terror. Their bodies, blasted apart in front of thousands, were meant to burn images into memory. The empire was merciless, resistance futile. For those tied to the cannons, the final moments were terror without escape. For their families, it was grief mingled with humiliation, forced to witness their loved ones destroyed like animals in slaughter. British officers often justified these acts as necessary to crush rebellion, yet their motives were steeped in paranoia and revenge. The mutiny of 1857 had shaken imperial confidence, and in response, the authorities embraced terror as theatre. In diaries and reports, some officers admitted their satisfaction in seeing rebels obliterated before crowds. Others described the silence afterward, a silence that seemed to weigh heavier than any cheer or applause. For the soldiers carrying out the task, the psychological toll was evident. Some turned to drink, some confessed nightmares of mangled bodies, and yet the executions continued, sanctioned by men who believed fear was the only language the colonized could understand. What did the crowds feel as they watched? Accounts vary. Some stood frozen, too terrified to move. Others sobbed openly, begging for mercy that never came. Children remembered these scenes for decades, passing the stories on as warnings. In the villages, the victims became martyrs, their deaths transforming into whispered tales of sacrifice. The British believed the cannon executions would extinguish resistance. Instead, they lit a fire of memory that no empire could stamp out. For those who stood at the edge of that square, forced to see flesh ripped from bone, the horror was unforgettable. And yet, this was only one example. Across the empire, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Burma, variations of this grim theatre unfolded again and again. Public hangings, floggings, torture staged before crowds, each designed with precision, each more grotesque than the last. And while the victims' screams faded into silence, the empire's reputation grew darker with every act. But behind these gruesome punishments lay something even more insidious. The political intrigues, the whispers of governors and generals, the court secrets that decided who lived, who died, and how their deaths would be displayed. And those secrets would prove just as disturbing as the executions themselves. The empire's brutality did not emerge in a vacuum. Behind every cannon execution, every flogging staged before horrified crowds, there were boardrooms, military councils, and whispered conversations in the corridors of colonial power. Decisions about life and death were not made only on the battlefield, but in the drawing rooms of governors and the reports dispatched back to London. Here, power struggles and paranoia festered, and court intrigue shaped the horrors inflicted upon millions. Within colonial administrations, factions battled over the correct response to rebellion. Some urged restraint, fearing that excess bloodshed would invite criticism back home. Others demanded merciless punishment, arguing that only overwhelming violence could hold the empire together. After the Indian Uprising of 1857, one governor recorded in his correspondence that leniency was a luxury Britain could not afford. His counterpart, however, wrote in private that the indiscriminate hangings and cannon executions would poison the empire's future. These disagreements were rarely aired in public, but their consequences were carved into the bodies of the condemned. Hypocrisy thrived in these halls of power. Publicly, the empire spoke of law, justice, and moral superiority. Britain styled itself the torchbearer of civilization, its parliamentarians declaiming against the barbarism of other cultures. Yet privately, colonial officers authorized acts that rivaled the cruelties of the very regimes they claimed to replace. Missionaries occasionally reported on the horrors they witnessed. The flogging of men until their bones protruded, women humiliated in public squares, villages burned as collective punishment. But such reports were often buried, their authors silenced. The empire's image had to be maintained, even if truth was sacrificed. Courtrooms in colonial territories became stages for this duality. Trials were conducted with all the appearances of legality, judges robed, prisoners brought forth, charges read aloud. Yet the verdicts were almost always predetermined. Witnesses were coerced, evidence fabricated, and sentences designed for spectacle. The condemned were paraded through streets before their execution, mocked by guards, their dignity stripped away so that their deaths would appear both inevitable and deserved. Behind the thin veil of due process lay nothing more than ritualized cruelty masquerading as justice. Whispers of scandal often seeped through despite official efforts at suppression. Letters from officers reached sympathetic ears in Britain, where debates flared over whether the empire's actions were righteous or monstrous. Some Victorians recoiled at accounts of prisoners blown from cannons or flogged to death. Others insisted such measures were the price of order. In drawing rooms and newspapers, the scandal was reframed, softened, or denied. Colonial officers who went too far were occasionally recalled, but rarely punished. The machinery of empire had no appetite for genuine accountability. Secrecy became a weapon as vital as the whip. Archives were deliberately purged, incriminating documents destroyed. Files marked confidential and hidden for decades. Only fragments survived. Diary entries, local testimonies, missionary letters, enough to hint at the scale of horror but never the full picture. This culture of silence was itself a form of control. The less the British public knew, the easier it was to maintain the illusion of benevolent rule. And yet, beneath the polished surface of official reports, unease lingered. Governors fretted about rebellion spreading, generals feared insubordination among their own troops, and whispers of discontent spread even within colonial courts. Power was never absolute, and every act of violence carried a risk that it would breed not submission, but vengeance. These were the secrets that haunted the empire's administrators. The knowledge that every order for another public execution was both a performance of power and a gamble against revolt. But the deeper horror lay not only in the secrecy of court politics or the hypocrisy of official rhetoric. It lay in how these spectacles of cruelty seeped into the fabric of society itself. The empire's arena acts did not merely punish rebels. They reshaped the culture of entire communities, leaving scars that outlived the soldiers and governors who inflicted them. The memory of cruelty did not end with the victims who suffered it. It spread outward, seeping into villages, towns, and generations that followed. When a man was flogged before his neighbors, the lash did not strike only his back. It struck the eyes of every witness, branding them with the knowledge of what power could do. When rebels were blown from cannons in India, the fragments of their bodies were gathered not just as remains, but as relics of defiance, whispered about in songs and stories. Communities carried these horrors in their collective memory, passing them down as caution and as quiet defiance. For common people, the arena acts of empire became part of daily life. A gallows erected on the edge of a village loomed like a dark monument, its shadow stretching longer than any church spire. Mothers warned their children of the fate that awaited those who spoke out. Fathers recounted in hushed tones the screams they had been forced to hear. Silence itself became a form of survival, but silence is never empty. It is filled with unspoken grief, suppressed anger, and the kind of fear that reshapes a culture. Among the nobility and collaborators of empire, the reaction was often more complicated. Some distanced themselves, turning away from the brutality to protect their own status and wealth. Others leaned into it, adopting the empire's cruelty as proof of their loyalty, even participating in the rituals of humiliation. The empire relied on these intermediaries, local rulers and elites who stood at the side of the British officers during executions, who nodded along as justice was delivered in blood. For the lower classes, such alliances deepened the sense of betrayal, creating fractures that tore through entire societies. Religion added yet another layer. In Christian rhetoric, punishments were framed as just, even divinely sanctioned. Rebellion was sin, and the lash was God's correction delivered through imperial hands. Yet for those who suffered, these same acts often transformed into stories of martyrdom. A man executed before his community was not erased, but sanctified in memory. His broken body became a symbol of resistance, whispered into folk tales and sung into lullabies. The empire sought to terrorize, but in many cases, it inadvertently created heroes. The cultural weight of these acts cannot be overstated. They altered the way communities thought about law, power, and fate. Laws once viewed as instruments of order became synonymous with cruelty. The word justice itself became poisoned, twisted into a symbol of oppression. Even when the gallows rotted away and the whips fell silent, their presence lingered in the minds of those who had lived beneath them. Generations later, during independence movements, memories of those arena-like spectacles were invoked as proof of the empire's true faith. In some cases, the rituals of cruelty even reshaped traditions. Communities avoided certain places where executions had occurred, deeming them cursed. Families of the executed carried stigma, their grief compounded by social isolation. And yet, the same sites sometimes became secret shrines, where people left offerings in memory of those murdered before their eyes. The empire may have believed it had erased these men and women, but it had only etched them deeper into cultural memory. By seeking to control through terror, the British Empire inadvertently left behind a legacy of resistance embedded in culture itself. Songs, proverbs, and oral histories carried forward the trauma, ensuring that even in silence, the past remained alive. The arena acts were meant to extinguish defiance, but instead, they sowed a seed that would grow into rebellion. The Empire never intended for cruelty to become a rallying cry, but that is precisely what happened. Still, there was a limit. Communities could endure humiliation, grief, and terror for only so long before something broke. And when that breaking point came, the spectacle of cruelty no longer instilled fear. It inspired fury. The turning point was approaching. The moment when the Empire's own rituals of domination tipped over into the beginning of its undoing. There always comes a moment when fear loses its grip. For decades, the Empire relied on the whip, the gallows, and the cannon as instruments of control. Each act of cruelty staged like a ritual, but no ritual can hold an audience forever. The cracks appeared slowly, almost invisibly at first, until suddenly the façade of invincibility shattered. The turning point was never a single act, but a series of horrors so excessive that they transformed dread into rage. In India, the rebellion of 1857 had been crushed with spectacles of unimaginable brutality. Men tied to cannons, women and children subjected to collective punishment, entire villages burned. For a time, the memory of those horrors paralyzed resistance. But years later, those same memories ignited the nationalist movement. What was once a wound became a scar, and scars are reminders that cannot be forgotten. Songs whispered in homes, stories told to children, and the very absence of the executed, fathers, brothers, sons, became fuel for rebellion. The spectacle of terror that was supposed to silence resistance instead became the seed of it. Kenya in the 1950s revealed this truth even more starkly. The Mau Mau uprising was met with camps where prisoners were beaten, castrated, and mutilated in front of others. The logic was the same as in India: terrify the many by destroying the few. But by the late 1950s, the world was watching. Reports of the Hola Camp massacre in 1959, where guards clubbed 11 detainees to death, leaked beyond Kenya. Photographs of corpses, skulls fractured by batons, shocked a public that had been told Britain was the guardian of justice. What had once been accepted as the price of empire now looked like savagery, unbecoming of a modern nation. International outrage grew, and at home, politicians who had defended empire suddenly scrambled to distance themselves from its crimes. The psychology of cruelty also began to turn inward. Colonial officers tasked with carrying out these acts found themselves haunted. Diaries reveal nightmares of bloodied bodies, officers drinking themselves numb to forget the screams. Some confessed privately that they feared what the empire had turned them into. What was once discipline became madness, and the empire's servants began to unravel under the weight of their own violence. Fear not only poisoned the colonized, but corroded the colonizer. For the people forced to watch these spectacles, the shift was different, but no less profound. At first, families wept in silence as loved ones were executed before their eyes. But as the years passed, that grief hardened. Mothers who had buried sons blown from cannons told their grandchildren not to forget. Survivors of floggings carried their scars into independence movements, their bodies proof of empire's hypocrisy. The arena of cruelty had been meant to destroy resistance, but instead, it forged identities built on endurance and the desire for justice. The empire reached its breaking point when the spectacle no longer inspired submission. Instead of cowing the masses, each execution became another name etched into the ledger of grievances. Each massacre became a rallying cry. The violence designed to secure control became the very evidence that delegitimized it. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire was no longer seen as a force of order, but as a relic of brutality. Its grip loosened not because it lost its armies, but because it lost the psychological war it had waged for centuries. The turning point, then, was not just rebellion or outrage in the colonies. It was the moment the empire's cruelty revealed the weakness it had tried so desperately to conceal. The fear that once kept millions in line now turned back upon its masters, leaving them exposed. desperate, and doomed. And from that point onward, the empire was living on borrowed time. The consequences of its arenas of horror would ripple far beyond the squares where bodies were broken, shaping the legacy of Britain's rule for generations to come. When the guns fell silent and the gallows stood empty, the empire did not simply walk away from its arenas of cruelty. The consequences lingered like ghosts, shaping the memory of nations and the legacy of Britain itself. The spectacle of terror had secured power for a time, but it left scars that refused to heal. Entire communities carried the trauma of what they had been forced to witness, and those scars became part of the very identity of the lands the empire once claimed. For the empire, the immediate effect was paradoxical. In the short term, cruelty achieved its purpose. Villages too frightened to resist, rebels silenced by fear of mutilation, entire provinces cowed by the example of a single gruesome execution. But in the long term, brutality hollowed out Britain's claims of justice and civilization. Every cannon execution, every mass hanging, every prison camp atrocity eroded the empire's legitimacy, both abroad and at home. What had been designed as performances of strength revealed themselves in hindsight as confessions of weakness. Historians later struggled with the record. In the 19th century, many British chroniclers softened their accounts, portraying the empire as reluctantly forced into harsh measures. The voices of the colonized were rarely recorded, and when they were often dismissed as exaggeration. Yet fragments of truth survived. Private letters from missionaries, diaries from soldiers who could not shake the images, local oral traditions passed from parent to child. These fragments painted a darker picture than the official histories dared. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scholars began piecing them together, uncovering what empire had tried so hard to bury. The image that emerged was not of reluctant justice, but of systematic terror. Archaeological and written evidence still bear witness. The remains of gallows stand in forgotten corners of former colonies, weathered wood and iron hooks that once carried the weight of empire's victims. In archives once sealed, yellowing documents reveal testimonies of torture, compensation claims from survivors, bureaucratic orders for executions signed in cold ink. Even the soil in some places tells the story. Mass graves unearthed, bones fractured by blunt trauma, bullets embedded in skulls. Each discovery reinforces what survivors had whispered all along. The empire's arenas were real, and they were far worse than official reports allowed. The legacy also shaped those who inherited empire's shadow. Independent nations often built their political identity around the memory of resistance. Martyrs executed in public squares became national heroes. Songs once sung in secret were transformed into anthems of defiance. Leaders invoked the suffering of their people as proof that independence had been earned in blood. The very acts meant to erase rebellion ended up immortalizing it. For Britain itself, the legacy was more complex. Many citizens grew up never hearing of cannon executions in India, or torture in Kenya, or the hundreds hanged in Jamaica. Empire was taught as a story of progress, trade, and railways, with the cruelty quietly excised. Only in recent decades, as survivors spoke out and documents surfaced, has the darker history begun to pierce the national narrative. The realization is uncomfortable. The empire's power was built not just on commerce or governance, but on blood spilled in public as warning. The lessons drawn from this legacy are sobering. Cruelty can enforce obedience, but it cannot create loyalty. Violence can silence resistance, but only for a time. Fear is a fragile foundation for power, because memory is stronger. The arenas of empire remind us that terror may dominate a moment, but its echoes stretch across centuries, shaping not only the oppressed but the oppressor. The British Empire, once the largest dominion in human history, carried within itself the seeds of its undoing, sown in the very spectacles it staged. And even now, long after the gallows have crumbled and the cannons have rusted, the echoes of those screams still reverberate through history. The image returns, as vivid as the moment it first struck the witnesses. A man bound to the barrel of a cannon, the crowd trembling as the fuse was lit, and in an instant, a human life obliterated into fragments that rained upon the terrified onlookers. This was not justice. The British Empire prided itself on progress, law, and civilization, yet in the dusty squares of India, the prison camps of Kenya, and the plantations of the Caribbean, it revealed another face, an empire of spectacle and cruelty. It is tempting to dismiss these acts as relics of a brutal past, but the parallels are not so distant. Around the world today, authoritarian regimes still use public punishment, mass imprisonment, and orchestrated displays of violence to control populations. The technology has changed, the stages have shifted, but the psychology remains the same. Fear is still wielded as a weapon, and power still cloaks its brutality in the language of order. There remain unanswered questions that haunt historians and descendants alike. How many atrocities were hidden? How many documents destroyed before the truth could surface? How many acts of cruelty have been lost to silence, buried in unmarked graves, or erased from official memory? We can reconstruct fragments, we can listen to survivors' testimonies, but we will never fully know the scale of what the Empire's arenas inflicted. That uncertainty itself becomes part of the horror. And so the lesson endures. Power maintained through terror is always temporary, yet the scars it leaves behind are permanent. The gallows may have rotted, and the cannons stand mute, but the memory remains alive in song, in story, in the very identity of nations that once suffered beneath imperial rule. To study these horrors is not to indulge in the grotesque, but to confront the reality that behind the polished image of empire lay nightmares staged for the world to see. What would you have done, standing in that crowd, forced to watch as neighbors and family were broken before your eyes? Would you have remained silent, or carried the memory as a spark for resistance? The British Empire's most brutal and inhumane arena acts remind us that cruelty thrives when people avert their gaze, and that the line between past and present is thinner than we like to believe. And perhaps the most chilling question of all, what other disturbing secrets still lie hidden, waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of history?